Welcome, everyone. We have a few more participants joining. Suchana, you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, of course. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to have you here. My name is Sunchana Pavlich, and I'm the Digital Communications Associate at Verified Voting. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently located in Washington, D.C. I'll be facilitating this webinar today, so I wanted to go through some items to make sure it runs as smoothly as possible for everyone attending. We enabled captions for this webinar. You can turn them on by locating your Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen and clicking the CC icon. Today, we would love to hear your questions, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. Each of you will be able to submit these questions by typing them into the Q&A function. This is also found on your Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any trouble locating these items or experiencing any other issues, please locate the chat feature in the Zoom panel and message me. I'll make sure to do my best to troubleshoot any issues you might have. And lastly, we would like to let you know that we are recording this webinar and portions may be shared and posted publicly. So now I get the pleasure of introducing who will be joining us today. First, Pamela Smith, the President and CEO of Verified Voting, Mark Lindeman, the Policy and Strategy Director at Verified Voting, Aurora Matthews, Senior Vice President, New Heights Communications and Strategic Consultant for Verified Voting, and finally, our Communications Director, Corey Emerson, who will take us from here. Corey?
Thanks, Suchana. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of new friends based on all of the attendees that I see so far, so welcome. I wanted to take a moment to introduce Verified Voting to everyone and reintroduce us to our old and wonderful friends as well. Our mission is to strengthen democracy for all voters by promoting the responsible use of technology in elections. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit based nationally. I'm currently located in the Philly suburbs. So, a big part of our work is about trustworthiness in elections and really supporting practices and advocating for practices that make election results trustworthy and give the public that confidence that their vote counts as cast. And we do this in a lot of ways. I'm going to lift up a few really important ones. We advise and assist election officials, especially in those ways that they check and confirm election results. That post-election period that you'll be hearing about a lot today, where a lot of things happen that the public doesn't necessarily know much about. And as we prepare for November's election, our strategy is really focused on working on the ground with those election officials, doing a lot of messaging work, talking to the media, talking with advocates, and really just combating this disinformation narrative that's out there that really thrives around election technology and a lot of aspects of our work. Educating the public about how elections work can be complicated at times. We hope that this research project will help you and, obviously help Verified Voting, but help all of us as we work towards November's election. Our vision is that all voters are able to cast an effective ballot without barriers, that voters can have justified confidence that their votes are counted as cast, and that ultimately foundational democratic principles are upheld. It's our 20th year defending democracy. It's a really big year for our elections, and we hope this presentation will be useful to you. Next slide. So the goals for this project were really threefold. The first was to assess confidence for voters ahead of the 2024 elections in different parts of the election system, focusing specifically on election audits, which I'll cover more in detail. We wanted to provide research-backed messaging recommendations that election officials and others can use to increase trust with the electorate, and also explore the perspectives of those election officials that surrounding audits and surrounding voter education efforts so that we can really collectively support their work in the field. Next slide. So before we get into, the weeds of what we found from this research, which is really exciting, I wanted to share a bit about election audits and checking the vote count, since I know we have some new folks here and some folks who might not necessarily be familiar with our work. So when a voter, so when you go to vote and when you cast your vote, whether that's in, by mail, in person, whatever. When you cast your vote, that paper ballot is counted and that initial vote count is checked. And that's an election audit. And this happens before the results are certified. So some kinds of checks on the elections are happening nearly everywhere in the country. If you go to our audit law database, which is on this slide, and we'll share in the chat, you can find your state's audit law there. And the audit laws vary by state. Some are considered better than others, but these checks can help demonstrate that the winner won and that the loser lost. We also collect information on voting equipment and how votes are tabulated and scanned. And this is on the Verifier, which is a really great resource for folks if you're interested in learning more about your jurisdiction or what's available to you. I really encourage you to visit that site as well. Next slide. So we approached our research in a few different ways. We wanted to do a combination of qualitative and quantitative research. So this qualitative research was really to assess where voters were at this period in January of 2024 in 4 swing states, which were Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These were 2 groups per state split by party ID. So we had, Democrats in one group and independent and soft-leaning Republicans in the other group. We also conducted a quantitative survey, which was among likely 2024 general election voters nationwide. And finally, a qualitative board of election officials that we recruited. This was 25 local election officials that logged into a dashboard of sorts over the period of several days, answering questions, talking with each other, learning about different things that we were sharing with them, and really getting their temperature on some of our key issues and really how they like to reach voters. And this happened in mid-March, which was a pretty busy time for them. So we're really grateful that they were able to participate in this. And this was all crafted and conducted by Lake Research Partners, excuse me, which is a national leading research firm. Next slide. So the key findings, if you take nothing else away from today, the too long didn't read version of what we're going to be sharing, voters are confident about the election systems in their own states, which is really encouraging, but they do have little to no knowledge about how they actually work. Election audits, that thing I was talking about earlier, those can be positioned as a proven way to affirm and ensure election outcomes, which can increase confidence. Upon learning about risk limiting audits, which is something we'll cover in a little bit, voters are supportive of this concept across political ideologies, and voters respond affirmatively to simple, positive language about our elections. Simple and positive. And finally, election officials really want voters to turn to them for information. There's room for outside organizations to collaborate with them and provide resources for them as well. Next slide. As far as confidence goes, in January, in these focus groups and later in the survey, elections were not top of mind for voters. The economy was, inflation, the cost of living and jobs. Those were top tier issues for voters across the board. Democracy and voting rights was considered a middle tier issue for most other demographic groups. But overall, when we asked in the survey if voters have confidence in their elections, the result was a resounding yes, which was very encouraging. Voters had high levels of confidence. Roughly 3/4 of voters thought the system of voting and elections worked well and are confident in the accuracy of the election results in their states, including 4 in 10 who believed it worked really well, which is very encouraging. Next slide. And the voters in the focus groups, it was kind of a similar vibe. They had confidence in the way that the elections and vote counts were done in their own states. Even in the states that have faced especially intense scrutiny, such as Georgia, which the pollster noted, Democrats are most likely to defend elections everywhere across the country, while independents and Republicans, they had questions about other states, but they still tended to defend their local elections in the focus groups. They did express concern, both Democrats and Republicans, about voter suppression efforts and accessibility issues. I remember vote by mail coming up a lot. Voters were concerned about that being restricted. Other laws that were popping up in these states that were in the focus groups, a lot of concerns there. But voters generally did have a sense about how their votes are cast and how their votes are counted, and they felt positively that there was some kind of check happening on the election results, but not too sure about it. Next slide. So this slide shows four quotes from one from each state that we focus grouped, and I thought that they really had a nice summary of what we, examined and what we saw across all of the groups. This Arizona voter said that it concerns them that some leaders are putting false information out there. A Georgia voter says, "I try to make up my own mind about whatever the situation is." A Wisconsin voter said, "I feel like it goes very smoothly and everybody's votes counted." And this Pennsylvania voter said, "No one is nonpartisan anymore." Next slide. So yeah, if no one's nonpartisan anymore in the focus groups, these voters had a hard time defining who they would trust when it comes to hearing about election results, which was concerning. There were some calls for in the focus groups for this like a nonpartisan, independent organization, but there was some disagreement, lack of clarity about what that would actually mean to the voters in the focus groups. And a lot of voters in the focus groups dismissed their elected officials, like their Secretary of State, their governor, and even in some cases, their local elected official as being biased political actors. So some work to do there. Most voters express a need for bipartisanship in all of the focus groups. Next slide. So we asked this question in the survey, and it was a bit clearer in the survey. We asked about different people and actions, and I'm going to read the list that is being displayed on the slide. We asked about trust ratings for poll workers, the governor, or if you're in Washington, D.C., the mayor, the local election official in your state, post-election audits, election officials in your state, local government in your area, the Secretary of State, local news sources in your area, national news sources, and risk limiting audits. And in this survey, voters have the highest levels of trust in poll workers in their states. Political figures also had higher trust ratings, and also local government and government officials. A majority of voters don't know what a risk limiting audit is, which we'll cover in a moment. Not a surprise for us, or many people maybe on this webinar right now. But post-election audits actually had a little bit of stick here, which was concerning. And voters unfortunately had low trust in news media. So next slide. So risk limiting audits, I want to take a poll. So we asked this in the focus groups and we asked this on the survey, and I'm launching a poll that will hopefully work. I'm polling you all. How familiar are you with the term risk limiting audit? A 4 being I'm very familiar. 3, I've heard of it. I've had some ideas. I'm not totally sure. 2, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it means. And 1, I have not heard of the term. And I will give you all 15 more seconds or so. Thank you for everyone who's responding. Okay, so we have a high response rate here, which is great, 79% of y'all. So this group is unlike actually the focus groups. It seems that 56% of you are very familiar with the term and know what it means, which is awesome. Um, some of 24% of you have heard of it and have some ideas, but you're not totally sure. 8% have heard of the term but don't know what it means, and 12% have not heard of the term. So we have a pretty well-versed audience here, which is awesome. So maybe we don't have to go into as much detail about exactly what a risk limiting audit is, but I want to share what the general public was feeling about this. Yeah, I should have shared those results sooner, but that is the result from the survey. Next slide. So we asked the focus group folks if they'd ever heard of a risk limiting audit, and no one had heard of a risk limiting audit in any of the focus groups in any of the states. The term risk limiting audit, when we asked if they'd heard of the word, it was a big no, and a lot of folks actually did not like the phrase risk limiting audit. They thought it denoted a pretty negative connotation. Folks liked accuracy, efficient. They were pretty turned off, I would say, by the name. But then we read this description, which I'm going to read in verbatim. In a risk limiting audit, a random sample of voters' ballots are checked by hand to confirm that computers counted the ballots accurately and that the election results are correct. An RLA can stop as soon as it finds strong evidence that the reported winner really got more votes, or it can lead to a full hand count of all ballots if it is needed. RLAs provide reassurance when outcomes are right, as well as protection against hacks and errors that could produce wrong results. They're considered the most accurate and efficient type of post-election audits by experts. Once voters in the focus groups heard this, they were like, yes, this sounds great. We want them everywhere. Now that I know what it is, I really like to hear that, these checks are happening, that the computers are being checked. They liked the reassurance and the protections. They did have some questions about this. The name was a bit of a roadblock, a pretty big roadblock, actually. There was also some concern about the term random, a random sample. Who's conducting the audit? Who's overseeing this? Just, some questions from the focus group participants. Next slide. So then we tested that same message in the national survey, and really, really happy to hear this. As they heard that description, over 6 in 10 voters now want RLAs in their state, risk limiting audits in their state, including 4 in 10 who want them strongly. There are some that do not want RLAs, and about a quarter of voters still have some questions here. I will highlight that independents, especially, were keen to wanting risk limiting audits in their state. The pollster said this is likely in part because they're more skeptical overall of the system and looking for more sources of verification. This is not on this slide, but I'll note that when we tested confidence initially, and then when we read this risk limiting, or when the survey or read the risk limiting audit description, voters who were initially not confident in elections and then heard the risk limiting audit description and became confident were majority white, non-college, pro-Trump Republicans, and they were disproportionately likely to be young, which is an interesting fact. Next slide. So messaging tactics. From here, I'm going to pass it to my friend Aurora.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Corey. So we saw a need really early on that we needed a simple, effective way to explain RLAs, and we needed to do it in a short period of time. So we worked with a partner firm who does videos, and we created this video in early 2023. So it's been out for a little over a year now, and it's 75 seconds. So we really kind of attempted to do a simpler explanation as much as we could in that 75 seconds. And we used animation, and actually we're going to share it with you right now. If you can play that, Suchana, that would be great.
How can we check that ballots are accurately counted during an election? Counting ballots by hand takes a long time, so most jurisdictions use machines to count. Post-election audits can then be used to make sure the machine's results are accurate. The best type of post-election audit is a risk-limiting audit, or RLA. RLAs are a form of quality control. Instead of recounting every ballot, we count a random selection of ballots by hand. Thanks to statistics, if we count enough random ballots and they show the same results as the machine count, we can be confident the election results are accurate. The number of ballots we inspect depends on the election results. The closer the election, the more we'll check. If the race is really close or we uncover unexpected results, we can even do a total hand recount. Ideally, RLAs happen after the initial count, but before official election results are certified. When machine-counted paper ballots are combined with risk-limiting audits, voters can be ultra-confident that the election results are correct. Learn more about election audits at verifiedvoting.org.
Great. Can we go to the next slide? So we showed this to the participants in the focus groups, and honestly, they overwhelmingly really liked this video. It was very, very positive, the feedback that we got. We had, one participant in Georgia who said, oh, this should definitely be a commercial that is running, every night on the local news. We had someone else who also said that anytime someone registers to vote, that this should be a mandatory video that they watch. It's probably not going to happen, but it was really great to hear that. And it was really validating on our side that we put this video together. And again, like explaining it in a really, really short period of time, a very technical process. Next slide. So based on what we've learned in our work, this huge gap continued to persist in how to communicate simply and effectively to voters about post-election audits. So we really tried to find messages that landed effectively with voters. And again, as Corey mentioned before, the term risk limiting audit didn't quite work for, people in the focus group. But this isn't really a project to rebrand. What we kind of figured out is that if we're able to explain how RLAs work, and then we get to that name, if we're leading with like the purpose, not leading with the term, that was really helpful. So we tested 2 messages in groups, then we took those learnings and we tested them a little bit more in the national survey. The first 2 messages we tested was proven and efficient. The proven message that really focused on how RLAs are proven to work. We used the validator of the American Statistical Association. And the efficiency message was more about how RLAs are the more efficient and accurate way. People really liked proven. They liked the validator, though we did hear from some people that they questioned whether the American Statistical Association was even real. But more importantly was that the efficiency message did not land at all. People said that costs should not be an issue for accurate results. It should take election officials as long as it needs to get accurate results. And so they really did not like this. So then we went ahead and we tested 2 other messages. The first one was a bipartisan and endorsers kind of message. There was a lot going on here. The first part of the message starts with trained election officials who take an oath to be impartial. It ended with endorsements from both parties. The second message, though, bipartisan and transparency, which I'll show on the next slide, that worked really, really well. We also tried to switch the words random with representative. Based on what Corey was saying, we got some feedback there to see if it landed better, but it didn't. Other people thought that this word was also a negative trigger. So I think there's some more work to be done there. Next slide, please. So like I said, the bipartisan transparency message scored the highest. I'll read it here. Risk limiting audits are conducted by trained election officials who are sworn to impartiality, often working in nonpartisan or bipartisan teams to ensure that neither party has influence over the process. The audit process is completely transparent and open to the public and is observed by people in your community at every step. At the end, the final audit results are reported and made available to the public, so we know that it was done fairly. Next slide. The second most popular message was the proven message, right? And so this one says, risk limiting audits are recommended by the American Statistical Association as the most proven, accurate way to check election results. RLAs have been rigorously tested for over a decade and are already used in 6 states, Nevada, Colorado, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Georgia, and can be used with any election system. It is important that all states start using RLAs consistently so we know our votes are counted accurately. People with this message, they really echoed the concern that kind of came out in that last sentence there, that RLAs are not already used everywhere. So this was really important for us to hear at verified voting, because obviously we want RLAs to be used everywhere, but people really, really felt that way. I also have a note here from Lake Research about, these two messages, and particularly the bipartisan transparency message. They would like to see something more like 60% of people say this was very convincing. What we got instead was something more like 33% said it was very convincing, and 60% said, it was convincing. But really, all the messages we tested, with the exception of that efficiency message that didn't score very high, the other ones scored very high with just really subtle differences. It's also worth noting that men and Republicans like the bipartisan transparency message the best, and women and Democrats like the proven one best. But again, this is like not night and day contrasts. The scores were really, really close together. And if anyone here wants to get in the weeds a little bit more, just reach out to us. We're happy to share it a little bit more, and so you can kind of see that full report. Next slide, please. So we also tested, who are the most trusted people to share these messages, right? Like when it comes to audits, who are the voters most likely to want to hear from? And we found here that most people said their local elections offices were the most trustworthy. Second on this list were election officials, the Secretary of State. So that's really helpful for us to hear. The next are nonpartisan groups. Again, we did have, the problem a little bit of people not quite trusting nonpartisan and whether anyone or any groups could be nonpartisan. But again, the bipartisan was a little bit more trustworthy. Something to note here about local news, we've seen in other messaging research that the people do trust their local news, definitely higher than they trust the national news. I'll say that as someone who works with the media, it was a little disappointing to see both local news and national news pretty low down on this list, but it's worth noting here. Next slide. So this is my favorite part of this all as a communications professional, because it really shows that so many communications methods that I really advocate for in my everyday work can actually be applied to many complicated election processes, including RLAs here. So some of the big takeaways we had were keeping it simple, avoid jargon wherever you can. And I know this is really hard, but again, it goes back to, leading with the purpose of something and then leading with the term where you can. It's also important to note that the voting public is not getting into the weeds about how thorough an audit is. A really good place to start with the public is just knowing that these audits and checks are happening. We want to use really clear and concise language, framing the message positively, using, like Corey said, the words accuracy and checks. People really reacted negatively to the word risk in risk limiting audits. They thought that was just too negative of a message. So where we can, framing things more positively. We always want to stick to the facts, avoid speculation as much as possible. Consider the messenger. That's what we talked about in that last slide there. Who is the best person to share these messages? Definitely emphasizing bipartisanship and transparency of processes. That tested really, really well with all of this. And then finally, centering election officials, which I know that Pam is going to talk a little bit more about. So I'll pass this over to Pam.
Thanks, Aurora. Next slide. So we had some ideas about election officials' views on audits and on their work, and we wanted to flesh that out a little bit more so we could better understand the challenges they have and support them better in their work. And what we learned was that election officials are confident in their abilities despite increasing challenges because they have a strong calling to the work they do. They're really passionate about elections being free and fair. And they're confident in their own systems. They think their elections are secure and run well. They prioritize voters. They have a lot of confidence in the systems they have in place, although they will acknowledge where those can be improved, especially on issues like increasing access. Next slide. So, as many of you already know, since 2020, election officials have been experiencing really significant challenges. There's been more demands on them, but not more resources. And while views are split on whether physical violence is a major concern, depending on their state that they're working in, almost all election officials acknowledge that threats and harassment towards them and towards poll workers are on the rise. In addition to harassment by way of incessant phone calls, abusive phone calls and emails, election workers have reported an increase in frivolous FOIA requests that are time-consuming and burdensome and seem designed to target them and make their jobs harder. One Michigan official said that the threats against them have increased tenfold. An Arkansas official said it's not too bad here other than being harassed by these ridiculous FOIAs from people who think they're going to find some non-existent monster under the bed. One Missouri official said that it's like we're on trial for doing the very job that we love to do. And it takes some of the love of the job away. I understand why many are retiring or leaving the profession. Officials also have concerns about frequent changes in election laws and processes, especially when those changes disenfranchise voters or when they're not based on input from election officials about how elections actually work. Next slide. So communicating with the public is really important to election officials. They feel it's really critical to transparency with the communities that they serve, but lack of resources and capacity is a major issue. They try really hard to go above and beyond the basic legal requirements, like this process is happening on this date in this place, but they're having to balance a high volume of work with not enough staff and not enough funding. And so communication sometimes is the thing that falls by the wayside. The most commonly used platforms that they're using include Facebook. They also have official state or local election websites, often local earned media, paper and radio, and community events. And community events are kind of important to election officials. One Wisconsin official talked about doing an election 411 presentation at our local library. Another said, I speak at community events when I'm invited. And another said, we both attend and host community events. So they're seen as a way to boost trust and engagement with the public and let people ask questions that they might have. One big wish that election officials have is that the public knew anything at all about the fact that there are audits, that they are checking, that they exist. We do them. You can observe. And they like that audits can reassure people who have reasonable questions, even though they know that some people won't ever be convinced. Next slide. As we wrapped up our research, the feedback from election officials was, this was really interesting learning more about this work in other parts of the country. And to me, it was a great benefit of doing this part of the research that the participants came away with a sense of solidarity with their peers around the country, that they were a little surprised to know that some of the issues they were facing were the same as what people in other parts of the country were facing. And one thing in particular, they really celebrated the dedication that those who do this critical work have for the work. And a Rhode Island official said this really gave us ideas about other things we can do. And in Montana, they said, we all need to stay positive and continue to do the very best we can for our people. In Arkansas, I thought it was just here. See that some similarities to what we're facing are happening elsewhere. A Massachusetts official also said that they were continually impressed by their colleagues across the country who do this work on behalf of democracy. And it's not for glory of any type, but really to continue to uphold everyone's right to cast that ballot. And I think words to live by from an official in Missouri, what we do is important and the experience we have cannot be lost. Prayers that we all make it out of 2024 and still want to continue to do this work. Next slide. So how can we support election officials? I think importantly for advocates, knowing that organizations who are in advocacy will be working in the election space this cycle, whether they like it or not, election officials want those organizations to engage voters positively and ensure especially that they're spreading accurate information about elections. That's an ongoing issue. They really want outside organizations to point to voters to official channels to get their information, or get the information themselves from official channels that they can then distribute rather than just sending out their own communications. So contact your local elections office, share information that they produce, ask how you can help them in that process. And using the messaging tactics that we've talked about today, you can help educate the public on election processes and how it works. And for everyone, really uplifting stories, positive stories about election officials serving voters and delivering our democracy is really important. You can find their local contact information on our verifier, and you can send them a note saying thank you for your service to democracy. Also, you can follow them on social media and bookmark their website. And one area that election officials really appreciate from both parties, they actively ask for help in recruiting poll workers, especially where they have to have poll workers from different parties in play. So I'll hand off to Corey, and she can tell you how to help with that.
Thanks, Pam. Next slide, please. So an immediate action for verified voting after this is we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the slides, the recording, and also the information that we've shared in the chat. So I just want to reinforce that. And we also have plenty of time for questions too, which I'm really excited about because we've gotten some great ones. But some practical actions that you can take as an interested, and informed person for our democracy. Registering to vote. I imagine a lot of folks here are already registered to vote, but definitely check your voter registration. We received an email yesterday about a woman who, had an incorrect voter registration file. You might not always be up to date. Your file might be inactive. It's really important to check your registration regularly to just ensure that it's all up to date and ready to go for election day, or for election season rather. And we like to use Rock the Vote. They have a really simple tool, and the link we put in the chat. And as Pam already said, find your local elections office on social media. Our verifier tool, you can look up your election official's name, address, and find them on social. We hear all the time from election officials that they wish that more people went directly to them. And finally, becoming a poll worker. This came up over and over again in the research. Election offices need poll workers. There's a link to a resource on the EAC's website that'll help you get the information you need about becoming a poll worker. And save the date, August 1st. It's National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. It's a really big day for activists to push out messages about getting people to help out on election day. A lot of times you get paid for it, sometimes you don't, but it's worth it either way. Next slide. And also, follow us on social media, verified voting. We're on X, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, and LinkedIn. We hope to share more information like this and, other really great resources leading up to the election. Sign up for our email list with this awkward-ish link that Suchana will put in the chat for folks to sign up if you're not already signed up. And also considering donating to support our education and outreach efforts, as our work ramps up throughout the year. So does our need for resources. So we appreciate you. And with that, I will stop and go to some questions that we've received. And I think I would like to start with asking one to Aurora about the media in particular. People trust poll workers and election workers to get the word out, but don't those folks depend on local and national media to do the job for them? And I'm curious what your response would be, Aurora.
They do. I would say they rely more on local media to get that local information for them. But again, what we heard, from our focus groups and from the national survey as well, was that people really want to get their information. They really trust the local elections offices more so than they trust, the local media. So I think it's incumbent on us too, as like communicators and being that go-between, that we're making sure that the media has the right information, It's part of my job to make sure that the media, is able to kind of communicate what is the process for voters, where they can find, the right information, to where they can go and find the right information on the website, right, of their local election officials, offices, but also, how they can check their registration, which is what Corey was just talking about as well. So I think there is a very good use out there for media to get the right information out there, even if they didn't quite score as trustworthy as I would like for them to score on. I think they're still very, very important for disseminating information here.
Thanks. And in a related effort, if we support local efforts to help get real information out and combat disinformation about election outcomes, absolutely. We hope that this research in particular will help election officials get, a nice, succinct information out to their voters. And we work, to get information from local sources out to really combat this like false narrative about elections and about how elections are run. We consider election officials to really be the number one, source for information for voters. We encourage people multiple times to reach out. If voters have questions, oftentimes an election worker is so happy to get questions ahead of an election. They offer to have folks come in and observe the elections process, open houses. These efforts are happening all across the country, and as much as voters can connect directly with their local elections office, I think the more ready we'll be come November when or even right now, as we continue to see, these efforts to really try to confuse voters, going to that first and trusted source is paramount. And I have one here for Mark in particular, maybe, about other types of post-election audits. Just like maybe generally, if you could talk about like what other types of audits are besides RLAs, since risk limiting audits were such a big focus of our research, and perhaps
Sure.
maybe
Is
a little
this,
bit of why we really focused on risk limiting audits for this.
and is this with reference to Charles's question?
Charles and Nancy's questions, actually. Nancy asks, what are other types of post-election audits?
Got it. Okay. Of audits that check paper ballots to see if votes were tabulated accurately, most audits still are what we often call traditional audits, and those typically have either a fixed percentage of precincts or a fixed percentage of voting machines, or sometimes it's a fixed number of precincts, that kind of thing. So the point being that in a traditional audit, the size of the sample doesn't depend on how close a contest might be. Whereas in a risk limiting audit, the closer the contest, the larger the sample will be in order to provide strong assurance that one or more outcomes are correct at the end of the day, at the end of the audit. So depending on circumstances, a well-conducted so-called traditional audit can provide much the same assurance, potentially higher assurance than a risk limiting audit, just because of how things are set up. For instance, in California, there is something called the 1% manual tally. And if the 1% manual tally is applied to all the voted ballots, which unfortunately it isn't, but that's an enormous sample. So it potentially provides a very large degree of assurance. Charles, we didn't try to go into that in this study because there's such a variation in the specifics of traditional audits. It would really be hard to do a fair comparison. But what we believe that if you look at what voters liked most about risk limiting audits, you can assess the extent to which that applies to the audits that a state is doing and figure out what a responsible and hopefully reassuring message would be. The other thing we can say is that in focus groups in states that were not currently conducting risk limiting audits, when people heard brief descriptions of the audits that were actually being conducted there, a fair number of participants said specifically that the risk limiting audit sounded better. So people are capable of picking up in something about risk limiting audits that sounds especially good.
Thanks, Mark. I have another one potentially for Aurora or possibly Pam. One moment, please. About distrust that's been reported in the media, how our survey really showed that voters do actually have a great deal of trust in elections. And Eric says he's surprised that the results don't echo as much of the Stop the Steal ongoing election distrust that's being reported. And what are our thoughts on why that might be?
I'll go first, and Aurora, maybe you have some additional color to add. So when we put together our focus groups, we didn't include hardline Stop the Steal participants. We had conservatives and independents as well as Democrat leaning, but we didn't have that sort of hard position in the focus groups. In the overall national survey, that went to anybody. So but even so, I think what it says to me is that although there are some really loud voices, they're not the majority. And so these numbers seemed like they were pretty on target as far as the national survey went. Aurora, any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, part of the reason why we're not seeing that is because that's not who we polled in this. It's not who we talked to. And we did that for good reason of just how we wanted to get some answers out and have, a really productive conversation. That's not to say these loud voices aren't important, because they're disruptive. They're incredibly disruptive. But like Pam said, they are not the majority and they're not necessarily representative. So I think, it's absolutely something we're facing, again in 2024, the same way we faced it in 2022 and 2020, that rise of distrust. And also with that comes the mis and disinformation that is kind of spewed from, the Stop the Steal. And that is, it's hard. I think, groups like ours and our partners as well. And I know a lot of, members of the media are really, really trying to get on top of that and work ahead of it this year. But, it is something that we are facing.
We have a question about the finding about how people responded to the listing of states that have risk limiting audits. I can, speak to that voters liked to know that these were happening in these states that we listed. And we took Georgia out of one of the split sample to see if it tested any better, because there, just the narrative around Georgia's elections, unfortunately. And there was really no difference in the list of states that we used that are already conducting risk limiting audits. Folks liked to know in the groups that there were other places already doing this, and they actually wished that it was happening everywhere, that every state was doing it. And in the focus groups, we didn't get too much into this here, but in the states that weren't conducting risk limiting audits already, like Wisconsin and Arizona, once they learned they didn't have a risk limiting audit, they were pretty bummed out about it. But they were also really supportive of audits in general. And this is a good question. Now that the focus groups have shown a little bit of doubt about the term risk limiting audits, how attached are we to using that term? I would say that's a really good question. And I think that the survey showed that we're kind of starting from a low recognition point with risk limiting audits. And if we wanted to adjust the name, it would be a good time to do it. But also I understand that there is a reason that it's called a risk limiting audit. I've seen other states call audits different names, which I think, it's an audit. It's your law, it's your practice. We recommend doing it a certain way. What you call it is what resonates most with people. I would really like, at the end of the day for folks to know that this is happening, and what it means. I'm open to what that name might be, but folks here at Verified Voting might also think differently about that. I don't think so though.
I mean, I think Aurora said it really well. You lead with what's most important to voters. And I think the study demonstrates that if you do that, you can then use the term risk limiting audits and people will be okay with it. So it's not a millstone. But if you make your mission to sell people on risk limiting audits, well, as a phrase, as a brand, actually your priorities are wrong. That's not a good strategy. That's my takeaway.
Thanks, Mark. Scrolling through here. The number of jurisdictions currently using risk limiting audits, and how that's increasing over time. I know that we are, working on, on our advocacy end to increase the number of states that are using risk limiting audits over time. I don't know, Mark, if you want to share any more about that.
You probably should have an infographic timeline. Hey, Corey, let me assign you some work during the webinar. No, it's a hard question to answer statistically because in every state that has risk limiting audits also are a work in progress. So it's a little hard to be sure of what to measure. But they have been steadily spreading both in extent and in depth. So the trend is positive.
What do we do when local election officials are actually not trusted by their voters, say a bad election worker, actor, and might not be doing the best job? What's the best recourse there?
I think that
Let's jump balls here. Up, go ahead, Pam.
No, I was just going to say that it tends to be a small number, and a number of states have begun setting in place processes to address that kind of issue. I know Colorado recently did that, and there are others. And I think that that's a really important step. Election officials, the great number of election officials don't want to be painted with the same brush as election officials who maybe are, doing things that are outside of the ordinary, outside of the rules, and it matters to them that this should be a very professional kind of job. So.
Might be useful to add during the risk limiting audit hand count in Georgia in 2020, a couple of counties in various ways had gone off the rails. And the approach of the Secretary of State's office in Georgia was to be really pretty candid about what had gone wrong and how it was being fixed. So I'm not an expert in crisis communication, but to me that tracks. People aren't expecting everything to be perfect. That's not the kind of trust we're trying to evoke. But people would love to believe that when something goes wrong, someone steps up to name it and fix it. And we support that in every way we can.
We've received a couple questions about if we've tested messages about other kinds of audits. And we did start pretty broadly within the focus groups, especially about post-election audits and transition to risk limiting audits. We didn't get into all of the audit. We only had a certain number of questions to ask and a certain number of hours for these focus groups. I would love to spend unlimited time and resources on learning more about all of this. We did especially focus on risk limiting audits for this, but I do think that depending on the type of auditing practice you're talking about or that is in place in your state, these principles, the ones that Aurora shared, can be applied to, you know, a post-election audit. You know, if there is transparency, if it is done in a bipartisan way, those things are the things that I think should be leaned on as we approach, you know, November's elections. That just because a state might not have, you know, a risk limiting audit in place doesn't mean that they still don't have a good audit, is my understanding. And, you know, you know, some of the things that we learned from this research, I think can be applicable to other kinds of audits too. And Jordan asked a question about if there's a boomerang effect when educating people about RLAs, if confidence goes up when they're in place in their state, and then confidence goes down when they learn that it's only in 6 states. That's a really good question. In the groups, the more people learned about risk limiting audits, unfortunately, you know, we weren't there to answer questions from these participants. I got the sense that they left actually feeling less confident in states like Wisconsin and Arizona overall. This group, you know, just the focus group participants, but you know, when they learned that there was, you know, any kind of check happening, I think that there was reassurance there. I don't know, Pam, do you have any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. They felt a little deflated. How come we don't have this here? Because once they'd seen the video and decided they liked it, you know, they wanted to know, why is it there and not here? But I think of that as a good sign. That means they want that rigorous check. And it's important that overall confidence goes up when people know someone is checking, just period, whatever type it is. So we got into the weeds with some folks, and yeah, they were a little deflated about that. But I think that bodes well for getting something in place later on in their state. So
I'll also add, just that's kind of interesting for this too, is that for the most part, people felt very confident in their elections in their local area, just in general, and little less confident about what was happening, you know, outside their state. They weren't too sure, you know, if they were in Georgia, what was happening up in Wisconsin, you know, but they were very kind of confident about what was happening at the local level. So I is where that confidence lies. And of course, states where they did find out, oh yes, these RLAs are already happening, they felt very buoyed by that. But Pam and Corey are right, you know, in some of these other places, as we got into the weeds, and they're realizing that, and very surprised too, that this wasn't happening in all 50 states, you know, that there was maybe a little bit of that boomerang effect.
We did receive a question in the chat that we answered, but I think it's good to lift up if there are ways to avoid any type of Maricopa County cyber ninja auditing conspiracies ahead of this year's elections. And if there's a way to get ahead of these false claims, the answer is yes. And it's webinars like this, it's education efforts about, you know, the post-election audits that are there, that are happening, that are part of law, that happen regularly, that are conducted by people in your community. And highlighting those transparent processes. And, you know, part of this, it's a public education effort on all fronts. It can't just be verified voting. It can't just be folks on the webinar today. It has to, you know, be at the state level all the way down to the local elections office, and showing the public that they are working after election day. The work continues the whole way up till the results are certified. And I think that, you know, that will certainly help mitigate potential calls for cyber ninja incidents, which I hope I never have to say that word again, but you know, it's early on in 2024, so what can we do? I think we were reaching time. I want to ensure we didn't get to every question today in the Q&A, but we will certainly reach out to folks afterwards with answers to questions. We have all of your contact information, and I really appreciate y'all joining us today. Just again, we'll share a email afterwards with the slides, the recording, hopefully the transcript as well, and any of the links we shared in the chat today. And really, if you could do one thing this week, it is sharing our risk limiting audit video on your social media. We'll make an easily shareable post for you, because I really like it. And it was just a wonderful experience to be able to test it and to get these messages out. So thank you all for joining us today. Pam, any final? See
No,
you.
I'm just grateful for all you folks and all your interest and all the work you're doing to help safeguard democracy. So thank you for that and stay in touch.
Thanks, everyone.